Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in Georgia's history. Please leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is when you listen to this narration. We want to know where these documented accounts go and when they do. In the fall of 1841, when the last leaves fell from the oak trees in Savannah, Georgia, Reverend Samuel Whitmore wrote something strange in his personal ledger. The ink had faded over the years, but the words were still clear. Conducted private ceremony at Rowland Estate. No witnesses present. God forgive what I have done. This simple note, found in 1963 while Christ Episcopal Church was being renovated, would lead investigators to one of Georgia's most disturbing stories of forbidden connection, family secrets, and the terrible price of crossing boundaries in antebellum society. In Savannah's business circles, the name Rowland meant a lot. Thomas Rowland made a lot of money in the cotton and shipping businesses. He had a big house on Abercorn Street and was known for being smart in business. From what society papers of the time said, his daughter Catherine was a beautiful woman with a lot of charm and education. She had studied in Charleston and briefly in Philadelphia. The Rowland family was famous not just for their wealth, but also for how recently they got it. Thomas came to Savannah in 1820 with little money, but in 15 years he had made a name for himself among the city's elite. Records from the Savannah Harbor Master's Office show that by 1838, the Rowland Shipping Company was in charge of almost 1/5 of all cotton exports. Chatham County tax records show that Thomas Rowland owned 17 slaves by 1840. This made him a mid-sized slaveholder by Georgia standards at the time. Most of them worked at his warehouses, by the river, or on a small plantation he owned 20 miles outside of the city. One of these people was a man whose name was only recorded as Elijah, male, age about 25 years, who bought property in Richmond, Virginia in 1836. Elijah was different from other enslaved people in the Rowland household because of his job. Thomas Rowland's business journals show that Elijah was his personal assistant. He went on business trips with him and handled his mail. For rich merchants of the time, this kind of deal wasn't all that strange. But what happened next went against all the social norms of the antebellum South. The first sign that something strange happened at the Rowland house comes from Elizabeth Hartridge, the wife of a well-known banker and neighbor of the Rowlands. She wrote to her sister in Charleston in January 1842, "There is the strangest air about the Rowland house these days. The daughter no longer goes to church or social events. Thomas has fired 2 household servants without explanation and refuses all callers." Mary Preston says she saw Catherine walking in the garden after midnight, but I can't imagine what would make her do that in the winter. The winter of 1841 to 1842 was especially bad on the coast of Georgia. The Savannah Republican reported that the temperatures were so cold in January that they partially froze the Savannah River, which had never happened before. The cold months may have kept whatever happened in the Rowland home a secret. The Georgia Historical Society has Thomas Rowland's business ledgers, which show an unusual pattern starting in December 1841. He had been very careful about keeping records, but now they were all over the place. There were large amounts taken out without any explanation. A note from December 27th says, "Payment to Whitmore, discretion required, $200. This amount, which is almost $6,000 today, was an unusual payment to a minister. Reverend Samuel Whitmore was the pastor of Christ Episcopal Church from 1835 until he died in 1852. Church records say he worked hard at his job, but in his later years he was troubled in spirit. His personal papers, found during the church renovation, include journal entries that show he was becoming more and more conflicted about slavery. However, like many of his peers, he never publicly called for its end. Historians looked more closely at his journals after finding his strange note about the ceremony at the Rowland estate. An entry from the 23rd of December 1841 says, "R. came to me today with a very strange request. My conscience is against it, but I wonder if refusing would stop the act or just make it more secret. If 2 souls are determined to do something, maybe it's better for them to get some blessing than none at all. I will pray for guidance." Whitmore's journal next mentions the Rowlands on December 26th. It is done. May God have mercy on all involved, myself included. The law of man and the customs of our society forbid it, yet I could not help but observe that their devotion appeared genuine. The consequences, should this be discovered, would be severe beyond measure. There is still a lot of debate among historians about what happened that night. There is no marriage certificate or official record, but the timing fits with rumors that were going around at the time about Catherine Rowland and an enslaved man on her father's property. These rumors never made it into official records while they were alive, but oral histories collected from descendants of Savannah families in the 1950 seconds mention the merchant's daughter, who married below her station, and the Rowland scandal that drove them west. The months after December 1841 were very different for the Rowland family. Property records show that Thomas Rowland sold his Savannah home in March 1842 for a lot less than it was worth, which suggests that the sale was rushed. Tax records show that he sold off most of his business assets in the next 2 months. The name Rowland is no longer found in Savannah's records by June 1842. The next time we have a record of Thomas Rowland is from a land purchase in the Missouri Territory in September 1842. The record says that Thomas Rowland and his family set up a homestead near Independence, Missouri. Missouri was a slave state and a frontier area at the time, so it was possible to start over there, away from Savannah society. The official record starts to fade here. There are no census records that clearly show where Catherine or Elijah lived in Missouri. In 1967, the Missouri Historical Society did some research and found an interesting document. A church registry from a small church near Independence shows that a Catherine Brooks was a member starting in 1843. There is no mention of a husband, but there are records of 2 children being baptized in 1844 and 1847, respectively. When you look at the name Brooks next to a manumission document filed in Clay County, Missouri, in February 1843, Thomas Rowland signed the paper which says that "My slave Elijah, henceforth to be known as Elijah Brooks, is free." The signature of the witness is partially damaged, but it looks like it was written by Reverend James Thornwell, the minister whose church Catherine Brooks went to. There is no official record that proves the link between Catherine Rowland and Catherine Brooks. There is no marriage license for Catherine Brooks, and census records from that time are known to be unreliable when it comes to women's identities because they were often listed only under their husband's name. But the fact that Catherine Rowland disappeared from Georgia records at the same time that Catherine Brooks appeared in Missouri, along with the strange manumission of Elijah with the last name Brooks, points to a very strange possibility. Records from the cemetery in Independence say that Thomas Rowland lived until 1859. The small headstone he has is very different from the wealth he used to have in Savannah. The probate records for his estate in Missouri don't say anything about Catherine, which could mean that they weren't close or that he made plans before he died to keep his assets away from her. In the context of history, the absence itself says a lot. In 1856, census takers in Missouri wrote down a household outside of Independence that included E. Brooks, colored, free, C. Brooks, white, and 3 children of mixed race. The census taker wrote, "Family lives alone, little contact with neighbors." This short note gives us a rare look at what Catherine and Elijah's life may have been like. It seems that they set up a home on the frontier that, while not accepted by society, at least didn't put them in immediate danger of the harsh legal penalties they would have faced in Georgia. The trail grows colder after 1859. The Civil War made it hard to keep records in Missouri, and many county records from that time were lost during the border wars that tore the state apart. What happened to Catherine, Elijah, and their kids is mostly unknown. There are no death records that clearly identify them. A historian looking into free black communities before the Civil War found an amazing letter in the collection of a historical society in Kansas in 1959. The letter, which was written by a schoolteacher in a small settlement near Lawrence in 1873, talked about meeting an unusual couple. The wife was the daughter of a Georgia planter, and the husband was born into slavery. They have lived here quietly for nearly a decade, their grown children having moved further west. Few people know their story, which they only shared with me after I had taught their grandchildren for 2 years and earned their trust. They talk about a ceremony that took place in secret more than 30 years ago, which they consider a true marriage before God, even if no state recognizes it. The letter doesn't say who the couple is, but the situation fits what is known about Catherine and Elijah. If this story is true, it means they eventually found some peace in Kansas, a state that was founded on the anti-slavery movement. The teacher's letter goes on. The woman still carries herself like someone who grew up in privilege, even though their home is simple. The man is a very skilled carpenter. What struck me most was how clearly devoted they are to each other after so many years and hardships. When talking about their early days, the woman said something that really moved me. Crossing the river from Missouri to Kansas felt like finally leaving Egypt for the Promised Land. The mention of Egypt brings to mind biblical images that would have meant a lot to many Americans of the time, especially those who had lived through or seen the horrors of slavery. Kansas, despite its own complicated racial history, was seen by many as a place of freedom after the Civil War. After this point, there is no more information about Catherine and Elijah in the historical record. There are no known graves with their names on them. If the census record is correct, their children would have been of mixed race and probably had their own problems in 19th century America. We don't know if they stayed connected to their parents' story or chose to distance themselves from it. As part of a larger study on how wealth was distributed before and after the Civil War, a doctoral student at Emory University tried to find descendants of Thomas Rowland's family line in 1968. His notes show that he found a few people who might be great-grandchildren of Catherine and Elijah living in California, but he didn't want to contact them directly because of privacy concerns. His research notes say something strange. Family oral tradition apparently preserves some knowledge of ancestors from Georgia and Missouri, but details have blurred across generations. Some resistance to discussing the matter suggests continued sensitivity around the circumstances. The Rowland home in Savannah is no longer there. It was torn down in 1912 to make room for business growth. There are no known photos of Catherine or Elijah. However, the Georgia Historical Society does have a damaged daguerreotype labeled Rowland Family circa 1840 that shows Thomas Rowland and what looks like a young woman, who is probably Catherine. The picture quality is too low to see her face clearly, so like much of her story, it is unclear. The grave of Reverend Whitmore in the Christ Church Cemetery has a simple inscription that says, "He served God according to his conscience." We can't be sure if this is about his general ministry or the fact that he performed a ceremony that was against the laws and customs of his time. When the church basement flooded in 1951, his journals, which might have had more information about the ceremony and his reasons, were badly damaged by water. A lot of the pages from the important time in December 1841 are hard to read or not there at all. There are only pieces left: a note in a ledger, property records, census entries, letters, and oral histories that together tell an amazing story of two people who went against the strict racial rules of their time. While the effects they faced were not fully recorded, they surely included exile, isolation, and the loss of privilege and status. The school teacher's letter from Kansas, on the other hand, suggests that they stayed true to each other even though things were hard. When people come across incomplete evidence, they tend to make up a story that makes sense of it, which could mean putting a romantic spin on what might have been a more complicated truth. We cannot ascertain the authentic nature of Catherine and Elijah's relationship, whether it exemplified genuine devotion, as the school teacher posited, or entailed elements of coercion intrinsic to the power dynamics of slavery. This main question is still unanswered because they didn't write down their own stories. We do know that their story took place in one of the most strict social systems in American history, where relationships between people of different races were not only discouraged but also made illegal. Georgia law in 1841 not only made it illegal for white and black people to marry, but it also made it very illegal for a white woman to have children with a black man. These laws showed how determined white Southern society was to keep the racial hierarchy in place and keep the line between free and enslaved people clear. In this situation, the choice of a wealthy merchant's daughter and an enslaved man to seek some form of marital blessing. If that is what happened in the Rowland household that December night, was an extraordinary rejection of social norms. The fact that they got this blessing from an Episcopal minister makes the story even more complicated. It shows that people sometimes acted on their own conscience, even in institutions that usually supported the status quo. The Reverend Whitmore wrote in his journal, "It is done. May God have mercy on all involved." This shows how serious his action was and how aware he was of what might happen next. His acceptance of a large payment raises questions about his motivations, but his clear distress in later entries suggests that he is really struggling with his morals, not just being greedy. The part that Thomas Rowland plays in the story is probably the most puzzling. Did he help his daughter escape to Missouri with his former slave out of love for her, and because he knew they were close? Or was his main concern keeping a scandal from hurting his reputation? Selling his Savannah properties for less than market value suggests that he is in a hurry, while building a new home in Missouri shows that he is planning. The manumission of Elijah, which cost a lot of money, shows that there was some level of acceptance. However, the fact that Catherine is not mentioned in his will suggests that he is still unsure about her or that he made a strategic choice to protect his assets. The evidence is incomplete, which means that there are many ways to look at it, each based on different ideas about how people act and the time period. Maybe this lack of clarity is appropriate for a story that went against the black and white thinking of its time. A story that took place in the gray area between what society allowed and what people wanted. Since Reverend Whitmore's mysterious ledger entry was found, many novelists and playwrights have tried to fill in the gaps in Catherine and Elijah's story. These made-up stories usually focus on themes of forbidden love and sacrifice, with the couple as tragic heroes who fight against the wrongs of their time. Although these works may convey emotional truths, historians exercise caution in making assertions beyond the constraints of available evidence. It is indisputable that Catherine Rowland disappeared from Savannah society at the age of 22, that her father abruptly moved to Missouri, that an enslaved individual named Elijah was granted unusual manumission under the surname Brooks, and that a white woman named Catherine Brooks emerged in Missouri records shortly thereafter. The combination of these facts strongly suggests a link that broke the strict racial lines of America before the Civil War. The historical importance of their story is not that it is unique. There have been other cases of relationships across racial lines in American history, but that it can be traced through historical records in an unusual way. This gives us a glimpse into how people dealt with, and sometimes broke, the strict social rules of their time. For contemporary Americans, the narrative of Catherine and Elijah occupies the nexus of individual autonomy and institutional subjugation, prompting enduring inquiries regarding agency, consent, and resistance. What looks like a possible love story in bits and pieces of historical records happened in a setting of deep inequality, which makes it hard to see it as a simple romantic story. The silence that surrounds much of their story shows how they wanted to keep things hidden and how official stories have systematically erased such relationships. We know about them mostly because of the chance survival of a minister's ledger entry, a neighbor's gossip, tax records, and a letter from a school teacher. These are all unrelated documents that together tell a shadow history that goes against the official version of antebellum Southern society. Workers digging near the old Rowland warehouse in Savannah in 1897 found a small tin box buried under the floorboards. There was a woman's gold locket with a braid of hair in it, black and brown strands woven together, and a piece of paper with the initials CR and EB, and the date December 26, 1841. The Georgia Historical Society received the artifacts as a gift, and they mostly went unnoticed until Reverend Whitmore's ledger was found in 1963 and linked them to the Rowland story. The locket is now in an archive drawer, a real but mysterious link between two people who lived outside the rules of their society and left behind only clues for future generations to find. Like many stories from the past, theirs is still not finished. It is a story made up of pieces with holes that make both scholars and regular people want to know more. Maybe somewhere Catherine and Elijah's descendants still remember their story, which has been passed down through the years as a family legend about ancestors who chose a hard path. Or maybe their story ended in Kansas, and the details of their early years in Georgia slowly faded from family memory as their kids and grandkids focused on making lives for themselves in a changing America. What echoes through the years is the deep silence that surrounds their choice. This silence was necessary in their time and has continued because of the incomplete nature of the historical record. That silence itself shows how strong the lines they crossed were and what happened to them because they did. The story of Catherine Rowland and Elijah Brooks is still a whisper from the past that we can only hear in bits and pieces. Their lives, with all the joy, sadness, love, and regret they had, still exist in that in-between space, between documented history and the vast realm of human experience that leaves no record. We know enough to know that their choice was very unusual and went against the strictest rules of their society, but we don't know enough to fully understand the complicated people behind that choice. Maybe that's how it should be, a reminder of how little we know about history and how private the lives of two people who tried to live outside of their time and place should be, leaving behind just enough evidence for us to admire their bravery. An old woman came to the Missouri Historical Society in 1954 with a small wooden box. The records show that she said her name was Margaret Wilson and that she was a retired schoolteacher from California. She said she was Catherine Brooks' great-granddaughter and wanted to give away some family items that she thought were important to history. The archivist who got the donation said that Mrs. Wilson didn't want to talk about her ancestors in detail, but she insisted that the items should be kept because they tell a truth that needed to be remembered. The wooden box had 3 things in it: a worn Bible with family birth and death dates written on the front, a hand-stitched quilt patch with the initials CR and EB embroidered on it, and most importantly, a letter from April 1878. The letter, which was written carefully on fragile paper, was simply addressed to my children and their children after them. At the bottom, it says, Catherine Rowland Brooks. The Missouri Historical Society kept the letter in their restricted archives because it was so fragile. It wasn't until 1965 that it was properly preserved and transcribed. Historians have argued about whether the document is real, with some saying it could have been made up later. But paper analysis and comparing the handwriting to known samples from the time show that it is real. The letter is interesting because of what it says and what it doesn't say. Catherine writes, I have never recorded the full account of my departure from Savannah, as such knowledge could bring harm to those I love, even decades later. But as I feel the approach of my final years, I wish to leave some truth for those who come after, so they might understand the choices that shape their lineage. She continues, abandoning privilege for something I deemed of greater worth, the man whom society declared my father's property, I declared my equal and my chosen companion. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. These words were spoken over us by a minister who risked much to follow his conscience rather than the laws of Georgia. My father's rage upon discovery was terrible, yet in time he found he could not entirely cast off his daughter. It was he who arranged our passage to Missouri, though I believe this was as much to protect the family name as from any tender feeling toward me. The letter talks about the problems the couple had even here in the West. We have lived carefully. Elijah's skill as a carpenter has provided our living, though he has often been paid less than his work deserved. I have taught our children letters and figures at home, as the schools would not accept them. We have known the pain of neighbors' doors closed to us, of church pews suddenly reserved, of whispered comments that fall silent upon our approach. Yet, I have never regretted the path we chose. Catherine talks about the future in a very moving way. To my children and theirs, you carry in your blood 2 streams that this nation has declared cannot mix. There may come a time when you find it easier to claim one ancestry and deny the other. I cannot judge what choices you will make to survive in this world that sees in stark black and white what is in truth infinite shades. But know this, your father was a man of dignity, intelligence, and gentle strength, who taught himself to read by candlelight after exhausting days of labor. And if there is any grace or learning in me, It came not from my privileged upbringing, but from the humility I learned walking beside him through this life. The letter ends with the words, "We will soon rest beneath Kansas soil, far from both Georgia's heat and Missouri's troubled border." What became of the Reverend who married us, or my father in his final years, I cannot say. The past recedes like the wake behind a ship, visible for a time, then vanishing into the greater sea. But love endures beyond the grave. This I believe. This amazing document is the only first-person account we have from either Catherine or Elijah. The way she talks, and the fact that she leaves out some details, show that she knows what her words could mean, even decades after the events they describe. The Bible that came with the letter has family records that show Elijah Brooks died in 1874 at the age of about 59. The inscriptions say that Catherine lived for several more years after him and died in 1881 at the age of 62. They had 3 kids who lived to be adults: Thomas, who was born in 1844, Mary, who was born in 1847, and Samuel, who was born in 1851. The names tell a story in and of themselves. Thomas, who may have been named after Catherine's father, suggests some sort of reconciliation, or at least recognition of that relationship. Samuel, maybe to honor the minister who did their ceremony. The fate of these children exemplifies the intricacies of racial identity in post-Civil War America. The Bible says that Thomas Brooks married a woman named Sarah Johnson in 1871 and moved to California when the population grew after the Transcontinental Railroad was finished. In 1910, his death was reported in San Francisco. Mary's entry says she married James Wilson, who is described as a schoolteacher of color. They lived in Lawrence, Kansas. The Bible says that Samuel died in 1879 at the age of 28, but it doesn't say anything about him getting married or having children. The items were given to Mary by Margaret Wilson, who would have been Mary's granddaughter, according to the family tree. Her unwillingness to go into detail about her ancestors with the Missouri archivist shows that mixed-race heritage was still a sensitive topic in the middle of the 20th century. However, the fact that she gave the family items to a historical society shows that she wanted to keep some part of the story alive. Dr. Ellen Martindale, a historian studying interracial relationships before the Civil War, tried to find and talk to Margaret Wilson in 1967. Her research notes show that she found Wilson's address in Oakland, California, but she had died in 1966. People who lived near her said she was very private and lived alone. She didn't talk much about her family. One person said that Wilson had been a well-respected elementary school teacher for more than 30 years. The broken trail of Catherine and Elijah's descendants shows how mixed-race Americans have dealt with a society that is obsessed with race. Some people, like Thomas, who moved to California, may have looked for places where their family history would be less closely looked at. Some people, like Mary, who married a man who was of color, accepted a black identity. The donation of family papers many years later is another example of this strategy, revealing history slowly and on the family's own terms. During the renovation of an old carpentry shop near Lawrence, Kansas in 1959, workers found a small leather pouch in a hidden compartment under the floorboards. There were 2 things inside: a hand-carved wooden pendant that looked like a bird in flight and a folded piece of paper with pressed flowers on it. There was only one line of faded ink on the paper. From the garden where we first spoke, Savannah 1839. There were no names, but the workshop's location matches property records that show it was owned by an E. Brooks from 1863 to 1874. These small personal items give us a look at the emotional side of Catherine and Elijah's story that official records can't show. The pressed flowers, which were probably brought from Georgia to Missouri and then to Kansas, show that they still have strong feelings for the place where their relationship started, even though it was dangerous and oppressive. The carved bird could stand for their path to freedom, but these are just guesses. In 1870, a census taker in Chatham County, Georgia, interviewed an old man named Isaiah, who had once been a slave and worked on the Rowland estate. This was during the time when Reconstruction policies were trying to change Southern society. The census form has a note on the margins that says, Subject volunteered story about master's daughter who married a colored man and was disowned. Claims they fled to the West. Account seems unreliable, not recorded in official tally. This is typical of how the census taker treated these kinds of relationships, pushing them to the edges of official stories and into the realm of rumor. But the story kept going on in different ways. In 1942, a project to collect folklore recorded an oral history from an 8-9-year-old black woman in Savannah. She told the story of a white lady who loved a slave man so much she gave up everything to go with him when freedom came. This story doesn't fit with the timeline of Catherine and Elijah's departure before the timeline, Civil War, but it shows how such stories were kept alive in community memory, often with details changed when they were told again. The historical neglect of relationships such as Catherine and Elijah's signifies more than merely the lack of documentation. Until fairly recently, these kinds of stories were seen as unimportant to mainstream historical accounts. They were embarrassing reminders of the contradictions in a society that had strict racial boundaries, but also had people who crossed those boundaries. Scholars of history often thought of these stories as unusual cases or romanticized legends instead of important parts of the historical record. In the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds, this view started to change as more and more scholars saw how important it was to recover histories that had been pushed aside. The finding of Reverend Whitmore's ledger entry in 1963 happened at the same time as this bigger reevaluation, which sparked new interest in the bits and pieces of evidence about Catherine and Elijah's story. What may have previously been regarded as trivial scandal or a mere footnote has evolved into a lens for examining the intricate dynamics of race relations during the antebellum era. Dr. Martindale's 1971 article in the Journal of Southern History, The Merchant's Daughter and the Boundaries of Race, was one of the first scholarly attempts to look at the evidence about Catherine and Elijah in light of larger historical trends. She contended that their narrative, although undeniably unique, was not as extraordinary as earlier historians had proposed. Instead, it was one documented case of something that probably happened more often than official records show, especially in cities where enslaved and free people had more chances to interact. Martindale pointed out how important Savannah was as the setting for the first part of their story. Savannah was a busy port city with a large free black population and enslaved workers. This made it easier for people to socialize than on rural plantations. Because Thomas Rowland was a merchant instead of a planter, his family lived in a more dynamic city where his business required him to move enslaved workers like Elijah around to different social settings. The historical record indicates that Elijah held an atypical role within the Rowland household. Thomas Rowland's business journals have many entries that show that Elijah wrote letters and went on business trips with him. These were jobs that required reading and writing, and a level of independence that was rare among enslaved people. An entry from 1839 says, "E. sent to Charleston with contracts for Harrington shipment. Returns Thursday with signatures." These kinds of duties would have set Elijah apart from other enslaved people and maybe even brought him into more regular contact with Catherine. It is mostly unknown what happened when they first met and how their relationship grew. Catherine's letter to her kids talks about the garden where we first spoke, which could mean that they had a private conversation on the Rowland property. The pressed flowers that were kept from this place suggest that this first meeting had an emotional meaning. There is no record of what they said to each other or how their relationship grew from there. It is clear that by December 1841, their relationship had grown to the point where they wanted some kind of blessing for their marriage, even though it was very risky. Reverend Whitmore's acceptance of their request, even though he didn't want to, is a shocking violation of social and legal norms. At the time, Georgia laws said that any minister who performed an interracial marriage ceremony could face harsh punishments, such as fines and jail time. Whitmore's willingness to go through with these risks shows either extreme kindness or extreme greed, or maybe a little bit of both. The $200 payment in Thomas Rowland's ledger raises some interesting questions. Was it a bribe to keep Whitmore quiet, a fee for services rendered, or, as some historians have suggested, money to help the couple leave Georgia? The large amount of money involved, which is equal to several years' worth of wages for an average worker, shows how serious the deal is, no matter what its exact purpose is. The ceremony itself is still a mystery. Whitmore's journal only says that it was done, but it doesn't say what the ritual was or what was said. Did he use the traditional Episcopal wedding ceremony, which includes solemn vows and asking God to bless the couple? Or did he make some changes to the ceremony that would let him deny that he had actually married someone later? The phrase, "no witnesses present," suggests that the person knew what the legal consequences would be and may have chosen to limit the number of people who could testify about what happened. The immediate aftermath seems to have brought both discovery and crisis. There isn't a direct account, but the fact that Thomas Rowland sold his property quickly and left Savannah suggests that the family situation was falling apart quickly. Elizabeth Hartridge's letter, which talks about Catherine not going to social events and Thomas firing the household staff, shows that things are not going well in the house. This could be because of the relationship or the ceremony. Even in the best of circumstances, the trip from Georgia to Missouri would have been hard, taking weeks of travel by river and road. For Catherine and Elijah, the dangers would have been even worse because they were traveling together as an unmarried white woman and a black man. They were probably still legally enslaved during the trip, which would have drawn dangerous attention throughout the South. How they made it through this journey and what help they got are still some of the biggest gaps in the historical record. Missouri, the place they chose to go, was in a complicated place in the antebellum landscape. As a slave state next to free land, it was a border where social structures were a little less strict than in the South. But it still gave Thomas Rowland the legal right to keep Elijah until he decided to free him. This manumission happened in February 1843, not long after they got there. This makes it seem like it was planned ahead of time, rather than a gradual change of heart. The historical record only gives us a few glimpses of the life that Catherine and Elijah built in Missouri. The census description of them as living isolated, minimal contact with neighbors, suggests that they chose to live alone on purpose, maybe to avoid the hostility that their relationship would have caused. Catherine's letter talks about Elijah's work as a carpenter, which shows that he made a living on his own. She also talks about how they taught their kids at home, which shows how hard it was for them to get to public places. After the Civil War, they moved to Kansas, which was founded on the anti-slavery cause. However, this did not mean that interracial marriage was accepted in society. During the Bleeding Kansas period of the 1,850 seconds, Kansas saw a lot of violence as pro- and anti-slavery groups fought over the territory's future. When Catherine and Elijah got there, Kansas had become a free state in the Union, but people's views on race were still complicated and often hostile. One of the few outside views of the couple's later life together is the letter from the school teacher in 1873 that talks about them in Kansas. The fact that Catherine still had the bearing of someone raised in privilege shows that some parts of her early life were still clear decades later. The comment about their clear devotion after so many years and hardships gives a rare emotional look into how strong their relationship has been, even though society has put a lot of pressure on them to end it. Catherine's letter to her kids shows that she is thinking about the choices that have shaped her life. The way she writes it, with a calm tone and careful omissions, shows this. She said she left privilege for something I thought was more valuable, which shows that she made a conscious choice instead of acting on impulse. She is very clear about how complicated family relationships can be when she says that her father's help in their escape may have been as much to protect the family name as from any tender feeling. What stands out the most is how she talks directly to future generations about their mixed heritage and the hard choices they might have to make in a society that is obsessed with racial categorization. The Bible records and Margaret Wilson's donations show how Catherine and Elijah's choice has affected their family over time. Their children and grandchildren lived in America after the Civil War, when racial hierarchies were still very strict, even though slavery was no longer legal. Thomas went to California, Mary stayed in Kansas, and Samuel died young. These different paths show how few choices people of mixed race had at this time. Margaret Wilson's choice to give the family items to the Missouri Historical Society in 1954 was made during the early civil rights movement. Her decision to keep these records private about her ancestry shows that she is proud of her family history and knows that people are still sensitive about interracial heritage. In the middle of the 20th century, it took a lot of courage for her to say she was Catherine's great-granddaughter instead of hiding this connection completely. The historical importance of Catherine and Elijah's story goes beyond what they went through. Their experience reveals the inherent contradictions within antebellum Southern society, a system that simultaneously denied the humanity of enslaved individuals while failing to inhibit human connections that transcended its rigid boundaries. No matter what personal reasons led to breaking these rules, it was a direct challenge to the ideas that underpinned slavery and racial hierarchy. The disjointed nature of their historical trail, consisting of a minister's cryptic note, tax records, census entries, family artifacts, and oral histories, illustrates the methodological challenges encountered by historians studying marginalized groups. The most important events often leave the least amount of evidence in the official record. This means that we have to be very careful when interpreting what is left, and remember that there are many gaps that can't be filled. The story of Catherine and Elijah does not offer modern readers a simple love story or a clear moral lesson. Their relationship developed amidst significant inequality, prompting inquiries regarding consent and power that remain unresolved. But if Catherine's letter is real, it says that she chose this path and will stick with it for the rest of her life, even though it was hard. What stands out the most from these pieces over the years is how hard Catherine and Elijah worked to build a life together despite all the problems they faced. They built a family and a home in a society that didn't think either was real, moving from Savannah to Missouri to Kansas. The pressed flowers from Georgia, the carved wooden bird, and the braided lock of hair are all personal items that show how people can connect even when systems are set up to keep them apart. The Georgia Historical Society put on a small show called Savannah's Hidden Histories in 1969. It included the locket with the braided hair and copies of the relevant documents. The exhibition text said, "The story of Catherine Rowland and Elijah Brooks is still not complete. We only know it through bits and pieces." But these bits and pieces make us rethink what we know about antebellum society and remember the people who lived outside of its borders, even if it was dangerous. There is no monument today that marks their journey from Georgia to the Kansas prairie. Historians have not been able to find their graves, if they exist. But their story lives on, a whisper from the edges of American history that challenges simple stories and reminds us of the complicated people who lived in even the most strict social systems. Catherine wrote to her kids, "The past fades away, like the wake behind a ship, visible for a while and then disappearing into the bigger sea. But love lasts beyond the grave. This is what I believe."